Hello friends, it is indeed my pleasure to welcome all of you to our lecture today on a comparative study of the British and American political institutions. We shall begin our discussion by saying that comparison emerged as a part of human attitude for self-evaluation while knowing about the behavior and activities of the others. In this context, it should be noted that comparison has its own style of theme, that a particular subject and refers to a particular subject or major idea in a discourse and occupies a significant position on any analysis of the science of government. In this context, it should be noted that Tocqueville points out that comparison is a very vital issue among political systems. It is necessary not only for knowing the political system, but also to know the virtues and shortcomings of the different political systems, as well as expand awareness on political issues and classify political systems in a better way. It also helps us in studying constitutions. In this context, it also should be noted that the American political scientist James Coleman also said that unless we can compare, we cannot be scientific. In this context, we must, and against this background, the attempt of the present lecture is to seek an understanding of the nature, scope of functioning of the major political institutions which constitute a major component of the governmental structure in two of the greatest democracies of the world, that is Britain and America. This study has been attempted in order to understand the uniqueness of both the states by referring to the nature of the political institutions, which will enable one to analyze the political process as well as understand the regulation of political phenomena in those countries. A comparative study of political institutions has been attempted, in fact, between the political institutions and functionaries in Britain and America, with particular reference to the three organs of the government, that is, the executive, legislature, and judiciary. However, due to constraint of time and in order to make the study systematic, I have attempted to classify the comparison into certain categories. For example, under the executive organ, I have attempted to make a comparison between the American president and the British king. On the other hand, we have also attempted to classify or make a comparison between the American president and the British Prime Minister, followed by a comparative study between the American and the British cabinet systems. Under the legislative organ, for example, a comparative analysis has been attempted on the basis of a comparison between the American and the British Speaker, a comparison between the American Senate and the British House of Lords, which form the two upper houses of their legislature, and a comparison between the American Congress and the British Parliament, followed by a comparison between the House of Commons, that is the lower house of the British Parliament, with the House of Representatives of the American Congress. Under the judiciary, however, I have attempted to make a comparative study by putting forward certain observations of my own on the basis of the judicial structure that functions and operates in both the countries. With reference to a comparative study on the President of America and the British King, the first difference or the first comparative point that can be made is that the king and the president are both the heads of the states of their respective governments and states. However, the king or the monarch is just a nominal head or a constitutional head of the state and not the government, while the president is the head of the state and the government as well. On the other hand, in Britain, the Queen is the constitutional head of the state, performing only and primarily ceremonial functions. The American president being both the head of the state and that of the national administration performs the ceremonial functions which, according to Lasky, constitute the decorative penumbra of office on the one hand, as well as also exercises real authority vested with the head of the government. Lasky remarks in this context that the American president is both more and less than the King of Great Britain. The president is more than the king because he is both the head of the state as well as the head of the government. He is the real executive. His powers are enormous. The king is only the head of the state, while the governmental powers are actually exercised by the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister. The President is the boss of the cabinet in America, who constitutes a cabinet of his choice and can include non-party men in his cabinet. The Queen, however, cannot take decisions on her own, ignoring the ministers who are the real executives in Britain. The Queen has only the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to govern. The President of America is the real commander-in-chief who can assume the command of the armed forces. In UK, the Crown is the supreme commander of the forces and not the king. The king is only a formal approval agency. The next difference between the American president and that of the British king is that the president enjoys the veto powers over the bills, which the king does not. The use of veto, pocket veto, along with messages to the parliament and his authority to issue executive orders in case of emergency makes the president the chief executive. The monarch, unfortunately, does not enjoy such authority. The next difference is that the Bureau of Budget frames the budget with the president's guidance, which is usually accepted by the Congress in America. The king or the queen in this context, however, plays no role, since making of the budget is primarily a prerogative of the minister. In other respects, that is, in certain other respects, we find the American president to enjoy a lesser status or powers than that of the British king. For example, the monarch holds office for life, but the president can hold office for a maximum period of 10 years only. The king reigns but does not rule, while the president rules but does not govern. The monarch is the head of the society, the church, and the head of the nation, being non-partisan. The President of America is an elected functionary of the state and is basically a party man and is neither the head of the church but only the head of the state. The Queen addresses the Parliament and has the power to dissolve the House of the Commons or prorogue the House of the Commons. No such power, unfortunately, is enjoyed by the American president. Due to the principle of separation of powers, the president does not play a direct role in the matters of legislation. The Queen also remains the symbol of Commonwealth of Nations, but no such position is enjoyed by the American president. Although the president holds the greatest and highest political authority, it is best described that the president has a halo of glory, but not the sanctity which is related and attached to the office of the British monarch. Now, on a comparative study of the precedent with the elected functionary of Britain, that is the Prime Minister, who according to Ramsay Muir is said to be equipped with enormous powers, we find that the two real executives of America and Britain are the Prime Minister in Britain and the President in America. The American President's term of office is secured constitutionally. He cannot be removed before the expiry of 4 years unless impeached by the Congress, which is a very, very complicated process. The British Prime Minister's office, however, depends upon his term upon the backing of the House of Commons. He continues as long as he enjoys the support of the majority and must leave as soon as the confidence on him, unfortunately, is withdrawn. The American president is indirectly elected by an electoral college, though the election in reality has become, over the years, a direct one, primarily due to the interference by the political parties in America. The British Prime Minister, on the other hand, is appointed by the Queen from the majority party in the House of Commons. Wilson notes in this context that the American president represents the whole nation and not merely a constituency. The president is the head of the state and the government, while the prime minister is, however, only the head of the government. The president is not responsible in any way to the legislature, while the prime minister is responsible, answerable, and accountable to the House of Commons. His influence on legislation, in fact, is direct, being the leader of the House of Commons, while the influence of the President is an indirect one. The American President is helpless at times if the majority in the Congress is against him, while the British Prime Minister, being the leader of the majority party, can get the legislation passed. The President has the veto power, while the Prime Minister of Britain does not enjoy any such veto power. The Prime Minister is the leader of the Cabinet, who cannot ignore in any way the advice of the Cabinet. The President, on the other hand, as has been pointed before, is the boss of the Cabinet, and his Cabinet members are merely his assistants. The President's power to make treaties and appointments is subject to the approval of the Senate, although the Prime Minister of Britain does not require any such approval. War in Britain can be declared by the Crown, that is, the Prime Minister in practice. In USA, it is not the President, but a power of the Congress. In USA, budget prepared by the Bureau of Budget under the supervision of the President, but Congress can modify it. In UK, the budget prepared by the Chancellor of Exchequer under the direction of the Prime Minister is apt to be accepted by the House of Commons. The American President derives primarily powers from the Constitution, while the Prime Minister of Britain, on the other hand, derives all his powers from that of convention. A comparison between the American and the British cabinets, however, has also been attempted below, and we begin by saying that both the American and the British cabinet are actually extra-constitutional growths and are the outcome of conventions. In Britain, we find that the cabinet constitutes the real government, since most of the members have been recruited from the lower house, while in USA, the president and his advisors are not drawn from the lower house of the legislature in any way. Political homogeneity is a cardinal feature of the British cabinet, although heterogeneity is more present in the case of the US cabinet, primarily because the president has the power to draw his assistance from various political parties, not restricting merely to his own political party. In this context, it also needs to be mentioned that the British cabinet functions on the principle of collective responsibility, while it does not exist in the case of the American cabinet. We also need to point out that the president acts as a boss over the cabinet in America, while the PM is the leader, or the prime minister is the leader of the cabinet in Britain. Membership of the cabinet is just a part of political career and not so vital. In the case of America, although being part of the British cabinet is a matter of great prestige and honor in the case of Great Britain. We also need to point out that the American cabinet is a cabinet more in name, while the British cabinet actually is the center where power actually resides and real executive power is actually exercised. After making a comparative study between the various functionaries under the executive organ, we now pay our attention to certain political institutions and attempt a comparative study under the legislative organ of the government of the two countries. We begin by making a comparative study between the American and the British Speaker. In this context, we find that in Britain, the election of the Speaker is unanimous. The appointment is made after consultation with the opposition. In USA, the election is completely a contested one. In UK, the president is returned unopposed from his constituency many times, but in USA, this never happens. The Speaker of the House of Commons, in fact, becomes a non-party man absolutely after his election, and he has no right or does not participate in the political debates and deliberations that take place in the House of Commons. On the other hand, the Speaker of the American House of Representatives, in other words, is identified closely with his political party absolutely openly. The British Speaker, in fact, acts more impartially because of his non-political character, while the Speaker of USA acts more as a leader of his political party to promote his party program. The rulings of the Speaker of USA are not final, although in the case of Britain, they are considered to be final. We also need to point out that in England, the Speaker never participates in the debates, or he does not have a right to vote in case of any kind of dispute or necessity for resolution of any matter, although such power is enjoyed to a great extent by the American Speaker. The partisan nature of the Speaker in the House of Representatives, in other words, does not earn the same honor and prestige as it gets in the case of the Speaker in the House of Commons. The American Speaker, in other words, is relatively weak in position in comparison to the British Speaker. We also need to point out in this context and turn our attention to making a difference between the Senate, which is the upper house of the American Congress, and the House of Lords, which is the upper house of the British Parliament. According to Harold Stannard, while the US Senate is the most powerful upper house in the world, the House of Lords, being the upper house of the British Parliament, is better termed as being the glamorous upper house of the world, while the Senate is the most powerful upper house of the world. The House of Lords seems to be the weakest of the upper houses in the world, However, making a comparative study, we find that membership of the Senate is very limited in comparison to the House of Lords. It is a very compact house with practically 100 members, while the House of Lords has a number of members of being practically 1,100 in number. The House of Lords is a hereditary chamber till partial reforms were undertaken in the near past. The Senate is an elected chamber completely. The House of Lords is a permanent body, while senators occupy the House for a period of 6 years, 1/3 although of the members retiring after every 2 years. The Senate, in other words, however, is a more lively and a more dynamic body with regular debates and discussions taking place in comparison to the House of Lords, which represents more of a hereditary chamber and a traditional legacy of the British political system. The debates of higher quality are organized in the Senate and not so much in the House of Lords. In past too, thus, the Senate occupies and enjoys greater superiority than that of the House of Lords. As a legislative body, in fact, by the Acts of 1911 and later by the Acts of 1949, the powers of the House of Lords have been curtailed and reduced to a large extent. On the other hand, the Senate is very powerful and it has overshadowed the House of Representatives in matters of legislative matters and enjoys equal and coordinate authority practically with the House of Representatives in America, although the House of Commons appears to be more powerful related to matters of legislation than that of the House of Lords. With regards to making a comparison between the British Parliament on the one hand as well as the American Congress on the other hand, we can say that the British Parliament has a larger membership than that of the American Congress. The British Parliament enjoys a greater sovereign status than that of the American Congress too. They differ in their relations, however, with regards to their relation with the executive. Although theoretically, we find that Britain, at least to some extent, or the British Parliament controls the executive to some extent, in the US, on the other hand, the Congress and the President seem to be standing apart from each other. Under parliamentary system in Britain, we talk of cabinet dictatorship, but cabinet dictatorship is not a distinguishing feature of the American Constitution in any way. However, the Congress has a greater control on the President than the British Parliament on the Cabinet. The British Parliament merely registers the will of the Cabinet, but the US Congress on many occasions has refused to approve proposals passed by the President. In this context, making a brief comparative study between the House of Commons, that is the lower house of the British Parliament, and with regards to the House of Representatives, that is the lower house of the American Congress, we can say that the House of Commons definitely enjoys greater authority and power than the House of Representatives, primarily due to its parliamentary character. We also need to point out that the House of Commons enjoys ultimate supremacy with regards to passing of bills, but in USA, the representatives cannot override the veto of the Senate. In fact, we find that one may agree with Harold Stannard that looking into the differences and making a comparison between the American and the British Constitution, the greatest difference lies when we try to make a comparative analysis in the position of the House of Commons and the House of Representatives and the status enjoyed by them under the British and the American Constitution. In this context, we need to mention that under the judicial structure also, undoubtedly, the American Constitution believes in supremacy of judiciary, and the Supreme Court of America is considered to be the highest judicial court and the most powerful judicial organ of the world. The system of judicial review also is not in operation in Britain, unlike in USA. Britain too, unlike USA, does not have a single integrated form of judiciary, although British sense of justice has been held in high esteem over the years. Hence, students, as we conclude our discussion today on a comparative analysis of the British and the American political institutions, we need to mention that both the constitutions have adopted different political institutions, but they are functioning successfully with a liberal democratic structure. While Britain has been a model or is a model for other countries with its parliamentary system of government and unitary governmental structure with a system of cabinet, system of government headed by the Prime Minister, who is rightly known as the prime ministerial form of government, and the Westminster model. America, on the other hand, being considered to be one of the greatest nations of the world at the present juncture, is functioning successfully with a presidential system of government and providing before us a classical federal model for any kind of reference. Thank you.